Well, first I'm going to introduce who I'm sitting on. I am sitting on the grave of Anna Wilson and Daniel Allen. I don't know that much about Daniel, but Anna Wilson and Daniel Allen were apparently partners, and Anna owned a brothel in town, and she, of course, amassed a fortune through that and real estate. And when she died, she donated all of her wealth and her massive mansion to the city, and she's buried here with her partner, and they have a 9-foot slab of stone over their grave, supposedly to keep the respectable women of Omaha from desecrating her grave. It also just happens to be the exact dimensions of a king-size bed, which I think is freaking awesome. This is my favorite grave here now. I feel very comfy in cemeteries, which wasn't always the case. Even though I was always sort of a morbid, spooky kid, I really didn't learn to love cemeteries until I was probably 16 years old. When I was a kid, they creeped me out. I think that being comfortable with cemeteries is a really easy way to access death and to reconnect with a really very interesting piece of a community. Cemeteries capture history, they capture local folklore, they capture the customs of the people who lived and died here. They capture socioeconomic status. And a really great example of that, one of my favorite cemeteries, and where I learned to love cemeteries, is Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Tarrytown, New York. This requires going back to my childhood because Sleepy Hollow and I have a fun relationship. When I was in preschool, my grandpa told me the story of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman and Ichabod Crane, and it scared the pants off of me. The story itself is kind of mediocre by today's standards, but my grandfather is an amazing storyteller, and he has this really deep, raspy voice, so it makes everything sound kind of scary. And all through my childhood, it was one of those things that really fascinated me because it scared me, was the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And when I was 16, I believe, my family made a trip up to New England and up into Vermont. And one of our stops was Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which is one of the more famous American cemeteries and the site of the story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it's this massive, sprawling burial ground, and you can go see a section of the cemetery that's 300 years old, and you can compare that directly with the newer portions of the cemetery. And there's part that that I remember driving down this winding road, and it's full of massive mausoleums for wealthy New York families. So these really big names of really affluent people buy up these beautiful spots. Caitlin Doughty is one of my favorite people within the death scene, I guess. She does YouTube videos under Ask a Mortician. She's written a few books. She runs a nonprofit funeral home out of Los Angeles. And she's really an activist, I consider her, in changing the way that we think about death and finding healthier ways and more eco-friendly ways of practicing death and dying in our society. But recently I was watching one of Caitlin's videos, and she was talking about her favorite graves. Early in the video, she said that it's a really great idea, if cemeteries freak you out, to go hang out in one and become comfortable with what's going on in that space. Like I said, when I was a kid, I really didn't care for cemeteries. My preschool was in Wayne, and to get there, we had to drive through the guts of Wayne. And right in the middle of town is this huge sprawling cemetery. And I remember, at least on one occasion, wanting to like stare at it, but kind of like just side glancing, because I don't know if I was freaked out by it or if I didn't want to get caught staring at a cemetery, but yeah, it was something that creeped me out. Even until when I was 13, my family went up to Vermont for the first time, and we saw my grandma's grave. And we played this fun family game, which is actually one of my favorite things to do in cemeteries, is to find the oldest headstone in a cemetery that is surviving and readable. And even then, I didn't want to go alone in the kind of far corners of these old cemeteries, you know, where it just drops off into the woods of Vermont. It feels so creepy and like something like out of a horror movie. But I became just super comfortable in the space to the point where when I was, like, my junior year of high school was really tumultuous. There was just a point where I was just so, like, stressed out. There's so much going on in my head that I drove really fast and recklessly to my town cemetery and just hung out in the quiet and just stood there between the headstones and just let myself calm down. I don't think that we let ourselves celebrate that quiet. I have to talk about my grandma. I really feel connected to her when I'm doing my research and when I'm in any graveyard, even if it's halfway across the country from where she's buried. And I don't think that my work necessarily celebrates her life, but I think it in a way addresses her death and the role it's played in my family. My grandma died in 1980, and I never met her. Obviously, my dad was a child at the time. And I think her death was so impactful on me because until I was 7 years old, I didn't even know that she had existed. My step-grandmother went to great lengths to try to erase any evidence of my grandma from this earth. And when I was 7, I don't know how I found out, but it was the gist of like, by the way, you have a grandma and she's dead, and she divorced your grandfather at, when my dad was a kid, and later died. So she raised him alone for a couple of years, and I never knew she existed. And to be 7 years old and to learn about somebody and then simultaneously have to grapple with their death, it was the first death that I had to deal with in that way, because other deaths in my family happened when I was simply too young to understand them or have much emotional investment in them because I didn't know the people very well. But this one really had an effect on me, and to the point where I really have deeply fantasized about what she was like as a person. I never knew her. People tell me I'm quite a bit like her, which just amplifies that. And she was just a complex, incredible woman. And I think of her a lot. And her headstone, when we went and saw her grave when I was 13, I was like, had this idea in my head of what it was gonna be like, what I was gonna feel and think, what I was gonna say when I finally saw the grave of my grandma. And it didn't happen. I saw her headstone, I was like, cool. And we cleaned it off because it had been neglected for 30 years. And those flat headstones that just lay on the earth tend to sink in, especially Vermont is really quite damp, so it just sank into the earth. And we just cleaned it, and I didn't feel connected to her when I was looking at her headstone and just going, yeah, that's my grandma. I felt connected to her when I was cleaning off the headstone, and I feel connected to her when I research death and when I think about, the way that it affects us, and the ways that we can let it affect us in healthier ways. Because there's this idea that we have to move through grief as quickly as possible, as coldly as possible, and that's historically hasn't worked for me. I don't think it works for most people. I think it's dangerous. I think it's unnecessary. And I think it is rooted in this idea that we can be objective and emotionless and remove ourselves from difficult things, but we can't. I mean, we're people, and when we lose those close to us, it affects us, and it should, and we should accept that and navigate grief in whatever ways that we need to. I consider myself part of the death positive movement. I have actually signed their website, so my name is associated really loosely with the death positive movement, which was founded by Caitlin Doty. And death positivity is a phrase that Caitlin Doty came up with in 2013-ish, I think, 2012, around then. And it's really rooted in the same concept as sex positivity, which is really demystifying and really becoming comfortable with a complicated topic through conversation, through discourse. So through art, through funeral work, through academia, we seek to have a healthier relationship with death. Death positivity isn't like, we should all just die. It isn't pro-suicide. It isn't pro-death outside of a lot of activism within the community. Does touch on things like physicians-assisted suicide and right to die and things like that. But it is about really understanding that we can lead better lives when we understand death. I'm really quick to criticize these people who think that we should absolve ourselves of death anxiety, because in my experience, death anxiety is what kept me alive. It wasn't so much that I feared death per se, but I really was made uncomfortable with the idea that after I died, I would no longer have agency over my own body. And that's really part of where I come from with the death positivity, is I think that we should have agencies over our bodies, living and dead. Another thing I'm always trying to be constantly aware of is that our ways of dying do reflect societal norms. And, I come here and I hang out among the graves and I feel very comforted by that, but I understand that these are affluent people who have these graves and whose graves are maintained and whose graves are made historical sites. And marginalized people aren't always given that same respect. And a great example of this that I can think of, and it is colonial people, but one of my favorite grave sites that I've ever visited is Old Burial Hill in Salem, Massachusetts. Old Burial Hill has my favorite headstone ever. The epitaph reads, an aged person who had seen but 19 winters in this world. Old Burial Hill is in Salem town, which Salem town was the affluent merchants, captains, army officers, etc. who lived there. Salem Village, which is where most of the accused in the witch trials lived, were the more impoverished working class farmers and such. And there are headstones and beautiful graves for the captains and for the affluent people of the community, the clergy, etc. I don't know if there's an existing cemetery for the working class people of Salem Village, and there sure as hell are no gravestones for the people that we killed in the Salem witch trials, a lot of whom were marginalized in some way. And it's almost sunset. Most cemeteries close at sunset. We're gonna get locked in! Another thing that really peeves me is I have stuff in my teeth. How long have I had lipstick on my teeth? Probably this whole time. I win. Actually, Anna Wilson wins, because she is forever with her lover under the slab of stone that is the size of a king-size bed.